Welcome to We Can Code It. Today we're going to be talking about CSS styling. To begin, what does CSS stand for? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it is the style layer of the front end. So this is what we actually use to interact with our HTML and change the way that things look so that we can give things a little more dynamic styling. And we can take a look at an example here of what this is actually doing for us. So here in this example, we have just a typical HTML document without any styling. So this is just the default styling that you get from your browser. But notice if we, in here, take out this comment inside of our CSS, we can see that we go from this standard default styling to something that looks a little more appealing and organizes our content a little bit better and gives us just a little bit of organization to our content. So let's continue with the slides. The first thing that we're going to talk about inside of CSS are selectors, and selectors are how we identify the elements that we want to style inside of our HTML. So this is going to be the first of 5. So this is the least specific way to select elements inside of our HTML, and that is to actually just identify the tags that it is that we want to change the style of. So looking at this example, we are changing the style of all the paragraph tags on our page. So in this case, we would have the background color of blue on all of our paragraphs, and the text color itself would be white. And again, this is the least specific way to select an element. So moving on to the next one level up as far as specificity when it comes to selection are what is called pseudo-selectors. So our pseudo-selectors are actually things that relate to our elements, our HTML elements, but aren't necessarily the tags themselves. So for example, our inputs can have a type, so we can select all of the input elements that have a type of text, as you can see in the example here. All of our inputs that have a type of text are going to have red text, so the color will be red. There are other pseudo-selectors that we can use, and you'll see these used frequently to specify specific states, which is the case with the focus pseudo-selector that you see here, as well as active. So in these states, any element that is focused will be selected, and we can change the actual styles depending on whether something is in focus or not, or whether it's active or not. Continuing with our example of input types, we can also select submit. So anything that has a type of submit, we could select that and have specific styles for those elements and specifically style them however we want to. So moving up the specificity ladder even further, the next one that we have is class selectors. So we can apply classes to our HTML elements, and we can use those classes to select elements inside of our CSS. So classes can be applied to multiple HTML elements. We can also apply multiple classes to individual HTML elements. So in this case, we're going to select any element that has a class of sans serif and give it this font family rule, which will try to first give it the font of Helvetica. If that's not available on the user's machine, it'll go to the next in the list, which is Arial. This is less specific and usually more supported. And if for some reason the user doesn't have Arial available to them in their on their machine, it'll just default to whatever sans serif is their machine's default sans serif font. One thing to note here about class selection is that we are specifying that we want a class by adding the dot operator in front of our class. So whenever you see a dot inside of your CSS, we're going to be referring to a class of some sort. All right, moving on, the next and most specific of the selectors is the ID selector. So the same way that we can give our elements classes, we can also give them IDs. So remember that IDs are different than classes in the sense that these should be unique identifiers. So only one element on your page should ever have an ID. So that ID should be unique to that element in each of your pages. And also you want to have just one ID per element. So you don't want to give multiple IDs to elements. So similar to how we were selecting things with classes on them, we're selecting things with IDs. Notice the difference here being that we are identifying our IDs with the hash symbol before the actual ID itself. But aside from that, this should look familiar to you. So we're selecting whatever element has the ID of page title, and we're changing the color to a variable of primary color, and we're going to get into CSS variables here shortly. So be familiar with this syntax, but don't worry about exactly what that's doing yet. The next thing is the font family is going to be changed to sans serif, and we're going to change the font size and enlarge that to 2 rems. So the 5th way to select elements is really not a new way, but it is a more specific way. So what we can do is actually chain selectors together to get more specificity to our selections. So what we have here in the first example is that we're selecting all the paragraph tags again. That should look familiar to you. But in example number 2, we can actually get more specific and select all paragraph tags inside of the header and apply some styling to that. So we can give any paragraph tags that are inside of our header element the background color of red. So this is going to affect only those paragraph tags that are inside of the header element. All other paragraph tags will remain unaffected by these changes. So notice in the third example that we can get as complicated as we want to with these selectors. So in this example, we're getting incredibly specific, and we're first selecting the anchor tags that are in focus currently, and then the anchor tags that are specifically inside of list items and direct children of list items. That's what the arrow is signifying there. And then we're going to take that selection and specify that it's only inside of anything that has the class of nav items, and then even further inside of nav tag, and then even further than that inside of the header tag. So we're getting very specific with this selection here. But we're going to give a border bottom to those elements of 1 pixel solid, and this color that we have represented by the hexadecimal code in the example there. So chaining selectors are a really good way to get really specific with the things that you want, so that you're only ever selecting the exact elements. We're not selecting, general groups of elements. We're just selecting specifically what it is that we want. So what I noted at the beginning is the default styling that we were seeing in our browser in our example from slide number 2. So if we don't declare any CSS rules, we are going to see the default styles from whatever the browser is that we're using. The important thing to note here is that all browsers have default styles that differ slightly from each other. So you can't ever count on the default styling to be consistent throughout browsers. That's why you'll see a lot of times we'll use a tool like Normalize. You can see in the link down here. A tool like Normalize will actually reset all of the default styles of whatever browser you're in, so that the actual styling environment of whatever browser you're using starts off with all of the same defaults, so that while you're building your CSS, you don't have any unexpected side effects from the actual default styles that you're getting from your browser. You know that everything is set sort of to a 0 essentially. We're starting from a clean slate, so that we know that our CSS that we write is going to be rendered exactly how we expect it to be. So there are a few different ways that we can declare colors inside of CSS, and we're going to go through those right now. The first that we're going to look at is hexadecimal values. So hexadecimal number is a number that is base 16 as opposed to a base 10. So we have all the digits from 0 to 9 that we use, and then we're representing 10 to 16 with the letters A through F. So these numbers are combining to specify a color value that we're going to be using specifically. So these numbers are actually represented in pairs. So the first pair of numbers, in this case 3 and 9, represent the value of red that you're getting from a specific color. The A and D that we're seeing there is representing green, and then the D and 1 are representing how much blue is present in the color. So we're actually making every color in the spectrum based on the amount of green, blue, and red that are inside of it. The next one that we're going to look at here inside of the border is HSLA values. So HSLA stands for hue, saturation, lightness, and alpha. Alpha, which you'll notice in the fourth example as well, stands for opacity. And so this is a way that you can actually specify the translucency, the opacity of your color. So notice the way that we're representing each of these values inside of the HSLA color selection is a little bit different. So the first value that we have is hue, and this is a number between 0 and 360, and this is representing some location on the color wheel. The next value that we have is a saturation, which is a percentage value. So this is exactly how saturated you want this color to be. So a value of 0 is going to give you a grayscale value, and 100 would give you like an incredible saturation of whatever that color is that you're selecting. Lightness is also being represented as a percentage-based value. So this is exactly how light or dark, so how much white or black is being added to this color. And then the alpha value, again, is opacity, and this is a number from 0 to 1 somewhere. So a decimal value of just exactly how opaque you want this color to be. So the third way that we can select colors inside of CSS is with keywords. And there are somewhere in the ballpark of 300 to 400 keywords that are recognized by most browsers at this point. So words like aquamarine or something more basic such as red or blue or green, these are all going to be recognized by your browser and rendered to specific values. And the fourth and final way that we can select colors inside of CSS is with the RGBA value. So these values are operating very similarly to our hexadecimal values, except we're giving the exact numbers that we want to use to represent how much red, green, or blue we're actually getting out of our color. So the first value, and these numbers are on a scale from 0 to 255. So 0 being having none of that color represented inside of whatever color you're selecting. So in this case, the 0 in red, there's no red inside of this color. And green is getting the value of 255, so this is the maximum amount of green that we can include inside of this color. And then 127 for the blue value, so this is half of the potential value that blue could have inside of this color. And then again, we have alpha, which is standing for opacity, and this is again a number between 0 and 1, so another decimal value. You can also click here for an example of Color Checker, which is a really valuable tool for figuring out what colors you want to use whenever you're developing your user interface, developing themes for your applications. So one of the next most important things that we're going to talk about inside of CSS are units. So there are a lot of different things that we need to have measurements for inside of CSS. Some of them are static, some dynamic. Most of the time you want to err on the side of using dynamic values. So let's dive into exactly what I mean when I say that. So the first unit that we're going to talk about is probably the most ubiquitous inside of CSS, and it's pixel values. So a pixel is a single area of illumination on your screen, and these are useful in getting specific sizes of things. So if you want something to be specifically 100 pixels wide, regardless of what the screen size of your browser is, obviously pixels are a good value for that because they remain fixed. They don't change based on browser window size or the base font size, which values like rems and ems do. So speaking of rems and ems, we can discuss those next. Rem units are based on the default font size of the root, and in our HTML documents, our root is our HTML tag. So if our root font size is 16 pixels, then one rem is going to equal 16 pixels at all times. And this is only ever going to change based on the font size of the root changing. So one rem is always going to be 16 pixels as long as the default font size in our root is 16 pixels. If we change that to 20 pixels, though, for example, one rem is going to equal 20 pixels. And M units, very similar to rem units, are based on the font size, but M's are different as they are based on the font size of the containing element. So even if we change even if we keep the font size of the root, the HTML element, the same size, if we change the font size of our H1 element, for example, the M units that we use inside of the styling for that are going to be based on whatever the font size for that H1 element is. So if we have our H1 element at 24 pixels, then one M unit inside of that is going to be 24 pixels. So continuing on with some more complex units, we're going to talk about percentage-based measurement now. So percentage units are based on the size of their parent element, and these can get complex as you can have percentage widths inside of containers that also have percentage widths, which is something that you'll see pretty frequently when it comes to developing responsive websites, things that are going to look good on mobile as well as your desktop. But an example of percentage-based widths, so we have a section element that has a width of 300 pixels specifically, and then we have an H3 element inside of that section that we're giving the width of 50%. So since it's inside of that section that is 300 pixels, 50% of that is going to be 150 pixels. And since our section is set to 300 pixels, it's always going to be 300 pixels, so our H3 element is always going to be 150 pixels wide. The next units that we're going to discuss are viewport height and viewport width. So these measurements are based on the size of your viewport, which is your browser window. So they're similar to percentage in that they're relative to the container that they're inside of, but only the actual browser window, not any of the actual HTML elements themselves. So these are really valuable units for responsive design. So we have, in our example here, we have a section with the class of container on it, and we're giving it a width of 50 viewport width units. So this is always going to be half of the viewport width regardless of how the screen size may change. So you'll see this a lot in responsive design, as we can make sure that something is always going to be half the screen size, whether it's on a phone or on a desktop or a tablet or anything like that. It's always going to be predictably 50% of that viewport width. Similarly, in the next example, we have an image with an ID of hero image. We're giving it the height of 40 viewport height units, so it's always going to be 40% of the height of the viewport. Again, really very useful for designing things responsively, so we don't need to know exactly what the screen size is that our user is actually looking at our application on. We just know that this element is always going to be 40% of the height regardless of what that device is. So the next thing that we're going to talk about inside of CSS is typography. So typography is something that you're going to want to control frequently. This is something that's going to change based on your user interface, whatever, any sorts of themes or whatever that you're developing for your application. You're usually going to want to have some sort of more specific typography so that your user gets the experience that you expect them to get. So notice that we are changing our fonts with the font family rule here, and so we're changing our paragraph to use this list of fonts. So we can actually have lists of fonts that we want to use. So the order of these lists is actually really important, because when your browser is looking at your CSS, it's going to try to use the first font in the list. If that's not available to your user, which is to say if it's not on their machine, then it will continue down the line until it finds a font that it can use. Our font family list can be as long as we want it to be. It is pretty common to see these things kept fairly short, but they only need to be as short as you need them to be. If you have a very specific list that you want to use, that's perfectly okay, but I would suggest trying to keep your font family lists to about 4 or 5 at the max. Usually 3 is where you want to be. Continuing with typography, this lesson is a little bit more of a design lesson than a programming lesson, but it's important to think about design elements as you're applying CSS styles to your application. So you usually want to stick to sans serif and serif fonts when you're actually using large bodies of text on your page, so things like paragraphs and blog posts, things of that nature, where your user is actually going to be reading like a good amount of text. Serif fonts tend to be better for things like titles, and that's just because of readability on screens. Sans serif fonts tend to be better for larger blocks of text, but I definitely would suggest only sticking to sans serif or serif fonts for actual blocks of text that your user is going to be like reading a lot of. I would avoid monospace, fantasy, and cursive typefaces. These things can be good for titles, headings, things of that nature, but they're really bad for large bodies of text because things tend to become pretty illegible when you're using these kinds of fonts. So usually stick to sans serif or serif fonts for large bodies of text. Try to avoid monospace, fantasy, and cursive typefaces, but if you are going to use them only for things like headings or titles or things of that nature. And the next thing that we're going to talk about is backgrounds. So most things have backgrounds that can be manipulated, and there are 3 options to choose from. We have images, colors, and gradients that we can use to change the style of our HTML. So the first thing that we're going to look at are image backgrounds. So the first thing that I want to note in the example is that these OR pipes that we're seeing here, these are not things that you would actually include inside of the style rules. These are just here to show you the options that you have inside of the style rule. So the first thing that we're going to look at when it comes to having a background image is declaring what exactly we want to use as our image for our background. So notice that we are declaring that inside of the URL function that we're using inside of CSS. Inside of that is a string that is giving your CSS a path to wherever your image is. And this is going to be a relative path to wherever your CSS sheets are saved in your file system. So in this case, we are going up one directory from what I would assume to be a CSS directory, and then accessing an images directory, and then we're getting the image path to my image.jpg, and we're going to apply that as the background image for our HTML element. So the next thing that we have to look at when we're using background images is background repeat. So we can actually decide if we want our images to repeat, and this happens pretty often when you see image backgrounds that are patterns. So there are 3 options for repeat, and the first is just repeat itself. This is going to repeat the background on both the X and Y axis. Respectively, we also have repeat X, which will repeat only on the X axis, and repeat Y, which will repeat only on the Y axis. The next option that we have is background size, and there are 3 different ways that you can do this as well. So we can declare an actual pixel value, where the first value is the width of the image, and the second value is the height of the image. So in our case, our background image here would be 300 pixels by 200 pixels. Another useful value for background size is cover. So we can use cover to make sure that our image is actually taking up the entirety of our element, whatever that may be. So this is actually going to expand your image's width or height depending on the size of your container to make sure that your image is always taking up the entirety of that, that element on your page. Length is another property inside of background size that does a very similar thing to color, but this will only expand your image's length as opposed to the length or height to make sure that it's always taking up the full width of your container. The last value that we need to look at with regard to background images is background position. So notice that we're using 2 percentage-based values for this. So this is going to position your image on the x-axis as well as the y. So the first value is saying where exactly on the x-axis you want this image to be placed, and the second value is where on the y-axis you want this to be placed. So in this case, we're going to have our background set to the center of this element. And continuing with backgrounds, the next option that we have, a lot more simple and straightforward, is background color. So this is pretty straightforward. With background color, you're just selecting a color value of some kind, so we can use either our keywords, our hexadecimal values, RGBA or HSLA, and we're just applying a simple background color to whatever elements we have. And this is pretty typical and really useful. It's for calling attention to specific things on your page. So in our example, all of our anchor tags are going to have the background color of yellow. So this is going to make them a lot more noticeable, and it's also going to identify them specifically as links. And the last background option that we have are gradients. So gradients are really good to get a little more complexity without having to have a whole image. So notice the way that we're declaring gradients is with the background image property. So it's your browsers actually treat gradients as images as opposed to just gradients of color. So it's actually sort of building an image for you and using that as the background of whatever your element is that you're applying these things to. So notice we have linear gradients and radial gradients, and the way that we're declaring our linear gradients is with at least 2 values. You can actually use as many values here as you want. You can have your gradients be as complex as you want. So in this case, we're going to have a gradient that starts at the top of your element and goes to the bottom of your element, and starts with the first value, which is this RGBA value that we see here, and goes to the second hexadecimal value. So notice that you actually can mix the way that you're identifying your colors inside of your gradient declarations. You don't have to use the same version, so you don't have to have 2 hexadecimal values, for example. You can have RGBA values, HSLA values, hexadecimal values, keywords, however you want to mix these things up. That's not a problem. With our radial gradients, we have one more option that we need to actually include inside of our radial gradient for it to render, and that is the actual nature of the gradient itself and where you want it to be. So in this case, we have a circle that's going to start at the center of this element, and it's going to have red in the center, and it's going to gradually go into blue. So we can actually get more complex with the actual declaration in our radial gradient of whether we want this to be an ellipse or a circle, and you can actually use percentage values, pixel values, things of that nature to actually define the complexity of whatever that radial shape is going to be. And we can also get more complex with where this thing is going to be located, usually again with percentage values, as far as the same way that we did with our background images. The first value is going to position your the start of your gradient on the x-axis, and the second value on the y-axis. So a really cool new thing that we have inside of CSS are variables, and these are relatively new to the CSS language. They came with CSS 3, and they are extremely beneficial because they allow us to build some pretty complex user interfaces without having to redeclare values a bunch of different times. So notice in a very rudimentary example here, we have just a primary color, a secondary color, and a tertiary color. Now imagine we were building a very complex UI where we have thousands of lines of code, and we're applying these values to multiple different items, and we decide halfway through our project that we want to change whatever the value of the secondary color is. Without CSS variables, we would have to go back, find every line of code where we're using specifically that color, and we would have to change it on every single line. With CSS variables, we don't have to do that. We have it declared just in one place in the root element here. And if we decide that we want to change the secondary color value, we only have to change it in one place, and it changes in every example inside of our CSS. Notice declaration of CSS variables. We're declaring them in the root value. So this is going to be whatever the actual root of your document is. Inside of our HTML documents, this is always going to be our HTML element. You can redeclare variables inside of other elements as well. So if we wanted to change the value of our primary color but only in our H1 elements, we could redeclare that primary color value inside of here, and it would actually have that new value. Make sure that you're using your CSS variables as much as you possibly can. Use them responsibly, the same way that you would use your other variables. They are a really beneficial tool, and yeah, definitely get used to using these. So now we're going to get some practice. So we have a CSS tutorial that we have put together for you here. So we're going to go ahead and navigate to this link. So we have here on GitHub, we have our CSS demo that we're going to go ahead and clone. So remember the clone or download button, we want to always clone, so we're going to copy the clipboard. And we're going to open our command line. And you should be inside of your code folder inside of your WCCI directory. If not, make sure that you're navigating there first. And we are going to get clone, and then remember Control-Shift-V to paste inside of your command line. And we're going to paste this URL that we just got from GitHub. Enter. And pull down our CSS demo. And now we can navigate to that directory with CD, and it is CSS demo. So we can make sure that we have all these files inside of here, and then we can have our command to open this up in Sublime. Remember, that is SUBL. And since we're inside of the directory that we want to open, we can just use the dot to indicate that we want to open this directory inside of Sublime. You can go ahead and hit enter. And we now have our CSS demo. And so we have an HTML document that's already marked up for you. And we have actual practice inside of the styles.css file here. So go ahead and each one of these comments is a challenge for you to complete. I do want to note that the default styles should not be changed. You want to make sure that these are, you're just keeping these here. So these are just basic basic CSS styles to give you a base to work with. Make sure that you're only making changes to the styles.css file. And once you finish that challenge up, I would encourage you to head over to the Mozilla Developer Network and see what they have to offer as well. You can take a look at that. So there is a wealth of information on CSS in the MDN docs, so please make sure that you come and take a look at that. So use the examples on the Mozilla Developer Network to play around on CodePen. CodePen is a really useful site for just playing around with your front-end languages. So head over to CodePen, make yourself an account here, and play around with all the new CSS that you just learned. And make sure that you're taking some time to look at other people's projects inside of here as well. CodePen is a social network, so you do have the ability to actually get into people's code and see what they're doing, and actually play around with some of their projects that are already created for you as well. So good luck with your challenge, and I'll see you in the next video.